I'm Sarah, 32, and this is the story of how one cruel joke at a family barbecue made me realize I had been living as a ghost in my own life, and how I finally chose to become visible again. For years, I thought I was doing everything right. I was the wife who remembered everyone's birthdays, the daughter-in-law who brought homemade desserts to every gathering, the woman who listened more than she spoke and smiled even when her heart was breaking. I believed that being needed meant being loved, that making myself small would somehow make others love me more. I married David when I was 25, full of dreams about building a life together, about becoming part of his close-knit family. His parents seemed warm and welcoming at first, and his sister Lisa had this confident energy that I admired. I wanted so desperately to belong that I molded myself into whatever shape seemed to fit best in their family dynamic. Somewhere along the way, I lost myself completely. I stopped voicing my opinions because they often differed from the family consensus. I abandoned hobbies that didn't align with their interests. I even changed the way I dressed, spoke, and laughed to match what seemed acceptable in their world. I became so good at being invisible that I forgot I had ever been anything else. The irony wasn't lost on me later. In trying so hard to be seen and accepted, I had made myself disappear entirely. I was present at every family function, contributed to every conversation, helped with every task, yet somehow I had become background noise in my own life. I was the supporting character in everyone else's story, including my own marriage. Looking back now, I can see all the warning signs I ignored. The way conversations would continue as if I hadn't spoken, how my suggestions were overlooked until someone else said the same thing. The subtle eye rolls when I shared something I was excited about. The way David would apologize for me when I expressed any opinion that differed from his family's views, as if my thoughts were something embarrassing that needed explanation. But it took one moment, one seemingly casual comment disguised as humor, to shatter the illusion I had built around my place in this family. Sometimes the truth comes wrapped in cruelty, delivered by someone who doesn't even realize they're holding a mirror up to your life. Sometimes it takes hearing your worst fear spoken aloud to recognize that you've been living it all along. Before I go deeper into my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. If you've ever stood your ground when someone failed to see your worth, feel free to let me know below. And if these kinds of stories speak to you, you're welcome to follow the channel for more. When I married David, I thought I was gaining a family. Coming from a small, quiet household where it was just me and my widowed mother, the idea of belonging to this vibrant, loud, connected group felt like winning the lottery. David's family was everything mine wasn't. They had traditions, inside, jokes, regular gatherings, and what seemed like unconditional love for each other. I threw myself into becoming the perfect addition to their unit. I studied their dynamics like an anthropologist, learning who laughed at what kind of humor, who needed gentle handling during stressful times, who responded well to compliments versus practical help. I became fluent in their family language, memorizing birthdays, preferences, pet peeves, and emotional triggers. David's mother, Patricia, loved to cook but hated cleanup, so I became the designated kitchen helper at every gathering. His father, Robert, enjoyed talking about his work in construction, so I learned enough about building codes and project management to ask intelligent questions. Lisa, David's younger sister, was studying to become a nurse, so I made sure to ask about her classes and clinical rotations, celebrating her small victories as enthusiastically as any blood relative would. I genuinely cared about these people, but somewhere in my eagerness to belong, I stopped bringing my authentic self to these interactions. When Patricia would make comments about how women should prioritize family over career, I nodded along instead of mentioning my own professional ambitions. When Robert would make jokes that made me uncomfortable, I laughed because everyone else did. When Lisa would dismiss ideas I found interesting as weird or impractical, I'd quickly change the subject rather than defend my perspective. At home, David would praise me for how well I fit in with his family. "You're so good with them," he'd say, and I'd glow with pride, not realizing that being good with someone shouldn't require erasing yourself. I thought adaptation was love, that flexibility was virtue, that being low maintenance made me a better partner. I began to dress differently for family events, choosing clothes that matched Patricia's conservative style rather than my own more artistic preferences. I learned to cook David's childhood favorites instead of exploring the international cuisines I enjoyed. I even started watching the same television shows they discussed, abandoning the documentaries and independent films that had once sparked my imagination. The most insidious part was how gradual it all was. Each small compromise felt reasonable in isolation. Skipping a friend's art show to attend David's cousin's birthday party seemed like the right choice for a committed wife. Declining a promotion that would require evening hours seemed practical, when David's family expected wives to be available for their frequent gatherings. Selling my piano to make room for David's home office seemed like a loving sacrifice for our shared future. But these weren't shared decisions. They were quiet. Surrenders I made alone, convincing myself each time that this was what love looked like. I told myself that strong relationships required sacrifice, that marriage meant putting your partner's family first, that being agreeable was more valuable than being authentic. My own mother noticed the changes during our monthly phone calls. "You sound different," she'd say. "Quieter. Are you happy?" I'd assure her that I was just growing up, becoming more mature, learning to be part of a team. I believed my own explanations even as something deep inside me grew smaller and dimmer with each passing month. Friends from before my marriage began to drift away, not through any dramatic confrontation, but through a series of declined invitations and shortened conversations. I was always busy with David's family obligations, always tired from keeping up with their social calendar, always stressed about some upcoming gathering where I needed to perform my role as the perfect daughter-in-law. By our third anniversary, I had become an expert at reading the room and adjusting my personality accordingly. I could sense Patricia's mood from the moment I walked into her house and modify my behavior to complement it. I knew exactly how much enthusiasm to show for Robert's stories without upstaging his punchlines. I had learned to laugh at Lisa's humor even when it came at someone else's expense, because being part of the group felt more important than standing up for abstract principles. I thought this was what successful families looked like. This seamless integration, this harmony maintained through careful attention to everyone else's needs. I didn't realize that in a healthy family system, there would be room for my authentic self too. I didn't understand that love shouldn't require you to disappear. The woman I had been at 25, opinionated, creative, independent, felt like a stranger to me by 32. I could barely remember what I had wanted from life before I started wanting what everyone else wanted from me. I had become so skilled at anticipating and meeting other people's needs that I had forgotten I had any of my own. The annual summer barbecue was Patricia's pride and joy, a tradition that had been happening for over 20 years. Every July, the extended family would gather in their backyard for an afternoon of grilled food, lawn games, and the kind of easy togetherness that I still marveled at after 7 years of marriage. As the date approached, I found myself looking forward to it with the same nervous excitement I'd felt as a newlywed. I spent weeks preparing for the event, not because Patricia expected it, but because contributing meaningfully had become my way of earning my place at the table. I tested 3 different potato salad recipes before settling on one that I knew Robert would appreciate. Less mayo, more herbs, exactly the way his own mother used to make it. I hand-wrote labels for the mason jars of homemade pickles I'd been preparing since spring, using the calligraphy skills I'd taught myself during the pandemic. David watched me bustling around the kitchen the night before, carefully arranging my contributions in containers that would travel well. "You know you don't have to do all this," he said, but not in a way that suggested I should stop. His family had come to expect my elaborate contributions, and we both knew that showing up empty-handed would be noticed and discussed later. Morning of the barbecue. I woke up with that familiar flutter of anticipation mixed with anxiety. Would my potato salad be well received? Had I brought enough pickles for everyone to try? Was my sundress appropriate? Or should I change into something more conservative? These questions felt normal to me now, part of the mental preparation required for family gatherings. I loaded my offerings into the car with the same care I might use for transporting fine china. The potato salad went into the cooler with extra ice packs. The pickles were nestled in a basket with a cloth napkin, and I'd even brought backup plastic containers in case Patricia needed extras for leftovers. David rolled his eyes affectionately at my thoroughness, but I could see the pride there too. He liked having a wife who cared enough to go the extra mile. The drive to his parents' house was filled with my usual mental rehearsal. I reviewed recent family news so I could ask appropriate follow-up questions. Lisa had recently started dating someone new. Patricia was dealing with a difficult neighbor situation, and Robert was excited about a vacation they were planning for the fall. I mentally cataloged these topics, preparing to be an engaged and interested family member. When we arrived, the backyard was already alive with activity. Patricia was directing traffic from her lawn chair like a general commanding troops, calling out instructions about where to set up the volleyball net, and reminding everyone to use coasters for their drinks. Robert was standing over the grill, with the focused intensity of a man who took his barbecue responsibilities seriously. Lisa was there with her new boyfriend, a quiet guy named Mark, who looked like he was still trying to figure out the family dynamic. I moved through the gathering, with practiced efficiency, helping Patricia organize the food table, complimenting her new patio furniture, asking Robert about the marinade he was using for the chicken. These interactions felt as choreographed as a dance I'd been rehearsing for years. Step, smile, listen, respond appropriately, move to the next conversation. My potato salad was met with enthusiastic approval, which sent a warm rush of validation through my chest. Patricia actually asked for the recipe, which felt like receiving a Medal of Honor. Several people commented on my pickles, and I found myself glowing under their praise. These moments of recognition felt precious to me, evidence that I belonged here, that my efforts mattered. As the afternoon progressed, I settled into my familiar role as the helpful background presence. I refilled drinks without being asked, cleared empty plates before they piled up, and made sure the elderly relatives had comfortable chairs in the shade. I was good at anticipating needs, at smoothing over small social friction, at being the kind of family member who made gatherings run more smoothly. Watching David interact with his relatives, I felt that familiar mix of love and longing. He was so completely himself with them, joking with his cousins, playfully arguing with his father about baseball statistics, teasing Lisa about her new boyfriend with the casual cruelty that only siblings can get away with. There was an ease to his presence that I envied, a security in his place within the family that I was still trying to earn. I found myself studying the other women at the gathering, particularly the ones who had married into the family like I had. David's cousin's wife seemed to have found her groove, jumping into conversations with confidence and laughing at inside jokes like she'd been part of them from the beginning. Another cousin's girlfriend was newer to the family than I was, but she had a boldness that I admired and feared in equal measure. She disagreed with Robert about politics without seeming worried about the consequences. As the sun began to lower in the sky and the afternoon moved toward its peak, I felt that familiar sense of satisfaction that came from a successful family gathering. I had contributed meaningfully, helped make the day special, and earned my place through service and consideration. I had no idea that within the next hour, everything I thought I knew about my place in this family would be shattered by a single comment that would echo in my mind for months to come. The stage was set, the players were in position, and I was about to learn that sometimes the people you love most are capable of cutting you deepest. often without even realizing they're holding a knife. The conversation started innocently enough, the way most devastating moments do. A group of us were sitting around the patio table after the main meal, that relaxed hour when everyone's bellies were full and the afternoon heat had started to ease. Patricia was telling a story about a neighbor who had passed away suddenly, and how shocking it was because the woman had seemed perfectly healthy just days before. "It really makes you think about mortality," Patricia was saying, shaking her head. "One day you're here, the next day you're not, and life just goes on without you." Robert nodded solemnly. "Makes you wonder who would even notice if you were gone. Some people, they're so central to everyone's lives that their absence would leave a huge hole. Others—" He trailed off with a shrug. I was half listening, still in the pleasant haze of a successful gathering, mentally cataloging the compliments I'd received on my food contributions and feeling that warm glow of belonging. I was thinking about how I'd tell my mother about the day during our Sunday phone call, how I'd describe the way Patricia had asked for my potato salad recipe. That's when Lisa chimed in, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she thought she was being clever. "Speaking of people no one would notice," she said with a laugh, turning to look directly at me. "If Sarah died tomorrow, honestly, no one would even notice." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the blood drain from my face, felt my chest constrict as if someone had knocked the wind out of me. For a moment, I couldn't process what I'd heard. Surely she hadn't just said what I thought she'd said. Surely this was some kind of misunderstanding, some joke I wasn't getting the punchline to. But then the laughter started. Not cruel, malicious laughter, but the kind of casual chuckling that follows what people perceive as harmless teasing. Patricia let out a little giggle. Robert made some comment about how quiet I was. Even David, my own husband, smiled and shook his head as if Lisa had made some mildly inappropriate but fundamentally accurate observation about my personality. The laughter felt like acid in my ears. Each chuckle was confirmation that this wasn't just Lisa being mean. This was the family consensus about my place in their lives. I was so forgettable, so insignificant, that my hypothetical death was material for casual humor. I managed to force my face into what I hoped was a smile, that automatic response I'd perfected over years of swallowing my real reactions. My mouth moved in the right shape, while inside I was screaming. The conversation continued around me as if nothing significant had happened because to them, nothing significant had happened. Lisa had made a little joke, everyone had laughed, and now they were moving on to discussing someone's upcoming vacation plans. But I was trapped in that moment, playing Lisa's words over and over in my mind. If Sarah died tomorrow, honestly, no one would even notice. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. Not only was I forgettable, but my forgettability was so obvious that it could be stated as simple fact at a family gathering. I sat there for the next 20 minutes, nodding and smiling at appropriate moments while internally spiraling. Every interaction I'd had with this family over the past 7 years suddenly looked different through this new lens. Had they always seen me as invisible? When they complimented my food, were they just being polite to the woman who would disappear, without leaving a trace? When they included me in conversations, was it just because I happened to be sitting there? The worst part was David's reaction, or lack thereof. My own husband had smiled at a joke about how unmemorable I was. He hadn't defended me, hadn't looked uncomfortable, hadn't even seemed to register that his sister had just casually dismissed his wife's entire existence as inconsequential. If the person who loved me most in the world could laugh at the suggestion that I wouldn't be missed, what did that say about how he really saw me? I started noticing things I'd been blind to before. How the conversation flowed around me as if I wasn't there. How my comments were acknowledged with polite nods before the discussion moved back to what really interested them. How I had become the designated photographer for group pictures because no one expected me to be in them. How my role at these gatherings was functional rather than social. I was the one who helped, who cleaned up, who made sure everyone else was comfortable. As the afternoon wore on, I felt like I was watching the gathering from outside my own body. I saw myself continuing to play my part, clearing plates, refreshing drinks, asking polite questions. But now I could see how peripheral I was to the actual heart of the family interaction. I was like a helpful ghost, present, but not really. There, contributing but not truly participating. The drive home that evening was torture. David chatted casually about the day, mentioning how much everyone had enjoyed my potato salad, how nice it was that the weather had cooperated, how funny Lisa had been with her stories. He seemed completely unaware that anything significant had happened, completely oblivious to the fact that his sister had just articulated what was apparently the family's collective view of his wife. When I finally found the courage to bring it up, to mention that Lisa's comment had hurt my feelings, David's response was exactly what I should have expected but somehow wasn't prepared for. He looked genuinely confused, as if I was making a big deal out of nothing. She was just being, "Lisa," he said. "You know how she is with her sense of humor. She didn't mean anything by it." But that was exactly the problem. She didn't mean anything by it because my feelings didn't register as something that required consideration. The comment wasn't calculated cruelty. It was casual dismissal, which somehow felt even worse. I wasn't important enough to be deliberately hurt. I was just invisible enough that hurting me was an afterthought. That night, lying in bed next to my husband who was already snoring softly, I stared at the ceiling and faced a truth I'd been avoiding for years. I had spent so much time trying to earn a place in this family that I'd never stopped to question whether they saw me as worthy of having one. I had been so focused on being accepted that I'd never noticed I was being tolerated instead. Lisa's joke hadn't been an aberration. It had been a moment of brutal honesty about how I was perceived by the people I'd been trying so hard to impress. And the most devastating part wasn't that she'd said it, but that everyone else had agreed with it enough to laugh. The days following the barbecue passed in a strange, muffled silence, as if I was experiencing life through thick glass. I went through the motions of my normal routine, making coffee in the morning, checking emails, having conversations with David about mundane household matters, but everything felt hollow and distant. Lisa's words had lodged themselves in my chest like a splinter I couldn't extract, infecting every interaction with a new awareness of my own invisibility. I found myself analyzing every relationship in my life through this new, harsh lens. When my coworker asked how my weekend had been, I wondered if she was just being polite or if she actually cared about my answer. When my neighbor waved from across the street, I questioned whether she would notice if I stopped appearing in my front yard. When the cashier at the grocery store smiled and asked if I'd found everything I needed, I wondered if I was memorable enough to be recognized on my next visit. The most painful part was reviewing my marriage with this newfound clarity. I started paying attention to how David interacted with me versus how he interacted with others. With his colleagues, he was animated and engaged, asking follow-up questions and sharing stories. With his family, he was relaxed and authentic, comfortable expressing opinions and emotions. With me, I realized, he was pleasant but distant, treating me more like a competent roommate than a life partner. Our conversations had become purely functional over the years. He'd ask what I wanted for dinner, tell me about problems at work, discuss weekend plans and household tasks. But when was the last time he'd asked about my dreams, my fears, my thoughts about anything deeper than grocery lists and calendar coordination? When was the last time I'd volunteered those things, or felt safe enough to be vulnerable with the person who was supposed to know me best? I began to see how I'd enabled this dynamic by making myself so agreeable, so low maintenance, that there was no incentive for anyone to dig deeper. I had become the human equivalent of wallpaper, present, occasionally noticed, but never the focal point of anyone's attention. I had trained everyone in my life to see me as background rather than foreground. The realization was crushing because it meant that Lisa's joke wasn't just cruel, it was accurate. If I disappeared tomorrow, who would be genuinely affected beyond the practical inconvenience of losing someone who paid half the mortgage and remembered to buy milk? David would be sad, certainly. But would he be devastated? Would he miss my thoughts, my personality, my unique perspective on the world? Or would he miss having someone to split household responsibilities with? I started thinking about my funeral, which felt morbid but necessary. Who would speak about me? What would they say? David would probably talk about how I was always willing to help, how I never complained, how I made his family gatherings run smoothly. Patricia might mention my cooking. Lisa might make another joke about how quiet I was. But who would talk about my dreams, my passions, my thoughts about life and art and the books that moved me to tears? The answer was terrifying. No one, because I had never shared those parts of myself with anyone. In my effort to be the perfect wife and family member, I had hidden everything that made me interesting or unique. I had become a collection of helpful behaviors rather than a whole person. I thought about the woman I used to be before marriage, before I started molding myself to fit everyone else's expectations. That woman had opinions about movies and music and politics. She stayed up late reading poetry and woke up early to watch sunrises. She had friends who called just to talk about ideas, not just to coordinate social events. She traveled alone, sometimes ate at restaurants with a book for company, spent entire weekends pursuing hobbies that no one else understood or appreciated. Where had that woman gone? I could trace her disappearance in small increments. The gradual abandonment of interests that didn't align with David's preferences, the slow withdrawal from friendships that didn't include the family social circle, the incremental silencing of opinions that differed from the group consensus. I had performed my own erasure so gradually that I hadn't noticed it happening. The worst part was recognizing how I'd done this to myself. No one had explicitly demanded that I become invisible. David had never asked me to stop sharing my thoughts or pursuing my interests. His family had never said I couldn't be authentic. I had made these choices, one tiny compromise at a time, because I thought being loved meant being easy to love. I had confused accommodation with affection, mistaken tolerance for acceptance. I had been so afraid of being rejected for who I really was that I had never given anyone the chance to love who I really was. Instead, I had created a version of myself that was pleasant and helpful and utterly forgettable. Then wondered why no one saw me as irreplaceable. During those strange, quiet days after the barbecue, I felt like I was grieving multiple losses simultaneously. I was mourning the years I'd spent invisible, the authentic relationships I'd never developed, the woman I used to be before I decided she wasn't good enough. I was grieving the fantasy of belonging I'd constructed around David's family, the illusion that being useful was the same as being valued. But underneath the grief, something else was stirring. It started as a tiny spark of anger. Not at Lisa, or David, or anyone else, but at myself for allowing this to happen. I was angry at the years I'd wasted being a ghost in my own life, angry at the dreams I'd abandoned, angry at the voice I'd silenced in pursuit of an acceptance that had never actually materialized. That anger was frightening because it suggested I had a choice to make. I could continue living as I had been, pleasant, helpful, invisible. Or I could risk everything to become visible again. The first option was safe, but soul-crushing. The second option was terrifying, but offered something I hadn't felt in years: the possibility of being truly seen and known by the people in my life. As I lay in bed those nights, listening to David's steady breathing beside me, I began to imagine what it might feel like to matter to someone. Not because of what I did for them, but because of who I was. Not because I made their life easier, but because I made it richer. Not because I was agreeable, but because I was authentic. The question that kept me awake wasn't whether I wanted that kind of connection. I did, desperately. The question was whether I was brave enough to risk losing everything I'd built in order to find something real. 3 days after the barbecue, I finally found the courage to address what had happened with David. We were driving home from grocery shopping, one of those mundane Saturday errands that married couples navigate in comfortable silence. But I wasn't comfortable anymore. The silence felt heavy, loaded with all the things I'd been too afraid to say for too long. I had rehearsed this conversation in my head dozens of times, trying to find the right words, the right tone, the right approach that wouldn't make me sound like I was overreacting or being too sensitive. I knew David's responses before I even spoke. He would minimize what had happened, explain away Lisa's behavior, and make me feel like I was making a mountain out of a molehill. "David," I started, my voice sounding strange in the quiet car. "Can we talk about what happened at the barbecue?" He glanced over at me, already looking slightly annoyed. "What about it? I thought it went really well. Everyone loved your potato salad." The fact that his first response was about my potato salad felt like a perfect encapsulation of how he saw me, as a collection of helpful contributions rather than a person with feelings. "I'm not talking about the food," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm talking about what Lisa said, about how no one would notice if I died." David let out a small sigh, the kind you make when someone is insisting on discussing something you consider pointless. "Sarah, she was just joking." "Round. You know how Lisa is. She has that dark sense of humor. She didn't mean anything by it." There it was, exactly the response I'd predicted. "But everyone laughed," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "Including you. My own husband laughed at a joke about how forgettable I am." "Because it was a joke," he said, his tone becoming more impatient. "It wasn't meant to be taken seriously. You're being way too sensitive about this." Being called too sensitive felt like a familiar slap, one I'd received countless times over the years whenever I'd tried to express that something had hurt me. It was David's standard response to any emotional reaction I had that he didn't understand or didn't want to deal with. It was his way of making my feelings my problem rather than engaging with them as valid experiences. "Maybe I am sensitive," I said, feeling something shift inside me as I spoke. "Maybe that's because I'm a human being with feelings, not a piece of furniture that you can make jokes about without consequences." David actually looked startled by my response. I couldn't remember the last time I'd pushed back against his dismissals, the last time I'd defended my right to feel hurt by something that hurt me. For years, I had absorbed his invalidation and convinced myself he was right. That I was. Too sensitive, too emotional, too reactive. "Where is this coming from?" he asked, and I could hear the genuine confusion in his voice. "You've never been bothered by Lisa's humor before. Maybe because I've never let myself be bothered by anything. Before," I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "Maybe because I've spent so many years trying to be the perfect wife and daughter-in-law that I forgot I was allowed to have reactions to things." The car had grown very quiet except for the sound of the turn signal as David navigated through traffic. I could feel him processing what I'd said, trying to fit this version of me, the one who spoke up, who pushed back, who demanded to be heard, into his understanding of who I was supposed to be. "I don't understand what you want from me," he said finally. "You want me to call Lisa and tell her she hurt your feelings? You want me to have some big confrontation with my family over a stupid joke?" "I want you to understand why it hurt," I said, feeling tears threatening behind my eyes. "I want you to see that your sister basically said I'm so insignificant that my death wouldn't matter, and everyone in your family agreed with her, including you. I want you to understand how that feels." David was quiet for a long moment, and I allowed myself to hope that maybe he was actually considering my perspective, actually trying to understand the impact of what had happened. But when he spoke again, that hope crumbled. "Look, I'm sorry your feelings got hurt," he said in the tone you might use with a child who's upset about something trivial. "But you're making this into something it's not. Lisa wasn't trying to be mean. The family wasn't conspiring against you. It was just a throwaway comment that you're taking way too personally." The word personally hit me like a revelation. Of course I was taking it personally. It was about me, personally. It was about my life, my existence, my worth as a human being. How else was I supposed to take it? When someone makes a joke about how unmemorable you are, how exactly are you supposed to take it? I asked. Should I have laughed along? Should I pretend it didn't sting to hear my own husband chuckle at the idea that no one would miss me? "You're twisting everything," David said, his voice rising slightly. "I wasn't laughing at the idea of you dying. I was laughing because Lisa was being dramatic and ridiculous. She doesn't really think no one would notice if you were gone." "Doesn't she?" I asked quietly, because from where I was sitting, it sounded like she was stating something she considered obvious. It sounded like the kind of casual truth that everyone agrees with, but nobody usually says out loud. David pulled into our driveway and turned off the engine, but neither of us moved to get out of the car. We sat there in the sudden silence, both of us processing what had just happened. I had never spoken to him like this before, never challenged his dismissal so directly, never demanded that he take my emotional experience seriously. "I don't know what you want me to say," he said finally, and for the first time, he sounded tired rather than annoyed. "I can't control what Lisa says, and I can't make you stop being upset about it." "I don't want you to control Lisa," I said. "I want you to see me. I want you to understand that I'm more than just the woman who makes your life run smoothly. I want you to care enough about my feelings to defend me when someone dismisses my entire existence as a joke." David looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his expression that I couldn't quite identify. Confusion, maybe, or recognition, as if he was seeing me clearly for the first time in years and wasn't sure what to make of what he found. "I do see you," he said quietly, but even as he said it, I could tell he wasn't sure it was true. "Do you?" I asked. "When was the last time you asked me what I was thinking about? When was the last time you wanted to know my opinion about something that mattered? When was the last time you treated me like I was interesting enough to have a real conversation with?" He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. The silence stretched between us, filled with all the conversations we hadn't had, all the connections we hadn't made, all the ways we had slowly become strangers living in the same house. Finally, he got out of the car and headed toward the house, leaving me sitting alone with the grocery bags and the weight of everything I'd finally found the courage to say out loud. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through years of memories that now looked completely different in the harsh light of my new awareness. David had gone to bed without saying much more about our conversation in the car, and his steady breathing beside me felt like a reminder of how easily he could move on from discussions that left me shattered and sleepless. I found myself taking inventory of my life, cataloging all the ways I had gradually disappeared. It started with small things I'd forgotten I'd given up. The poetry books I used to read voraciously, abandoned because David found poetry pretentious and boring. The weekend art classes I'd loved, dropped because they conflicted with his family's Sunday dinner tradition. The friends who'd slowly drifted away because I was always too busy with David's social obligations to maintain my own relationships. I remembered the woman I'd been at 25, before I'd decided she needed improvement. That woman had strong opinions about everything: movies, music, politics, social issues. She'd stayed up until 3 a.m. having passionate conversations about books and ideas. She'd traveled alone to cities where she knew no one, eating dinner at the bar of interesting restaurants with a novel for company. She'd had dreams that were entirely her own, unfiltered through anyone else's expectations or limitations. Where had that confidence gone? I could trace its erosion in increments so small I hadn't noticed them happening. The first time I'd changed my opinion mid-sentence because I could see David disagreeing with me. The first family gathering where I'd nodded along with a conversation, That made me uncomfortable rather than voicing my different perspective. The first time I'd chosen to stay quiet instead of sharing something I was excited about, because I could sense it wouldn't be well received. Each compromise had felt reasonable. In the moment, even loving. Good wives were supportive, flexible, willing to adapt. Good wives didn't insist on being the center of attention or make waves over minor differences of opinion. Good wives made their husbands' lives easier, not more complicated. I had internalized these messages so completely that I'd convinced myself I was being noble rather than self-destructive. I thought about the friendships I'd let wither. My college roommate Sarah. How confusing was it that I'd married into a family where I thought about the friendships I'd let wither? My college roommate Emma, who used to call me for hours-long conversations about everything and nothing. We'd lost touch gradually, not through any dramatic falling out, but through a series of shortened phone calls and declined invitations. She'd stopped reaching out after I'd canceled our last planned visit because David's cousin was getting married. That same weekend, there was my former coworker Janet, who'd invited me to join her book club multiple times before giving up. I'd always had excuses: David's family dinner, a work obligation, general exhaustion from trying to keep up with everyone else's schedules. Now I realized I'd been afraid to join because the books they read were the kind of literary fiction I used to love, but had convinced myself was too intellectual, too pretentious for the woman I was trying to become. Even my relationship with my own mother had become filtered through my performance as David's wife. Our phone calls had shifted from genuine conversations about my thoughts and feelings to updates about David's career, his family's activities, and surface-level pleasantries about my own life. When had I stopped telling her about my dreams, my frustrations, my real emotional experiences? When had I started editing myself even with the person who'd known me longest? The most devastating realization was how thoroughly I'd collaborated in my own erasure. No one had forced me to give up poetry or art classes or meaningful friendships. No one had explicitly demanded that I stop having opinions or sharing my thoughts. I had made these choices because I'd believed they were necessary for love, for acceptance, for belonging. I had been so afraid of being rejected for who I really was that I'd rejected myself first. I remembered specific moments now with painful clarity. The time David's father had made a dismissive comment about women's lib nonsense, and I'd stayed silent instead of mentioning my own feminist beliefs. The family dinner where everyone had mocked a movie I'd actually enjoyed, and I'd quickly agreed with their criticism instead of defending my different perspective. The countless conversations where I'd nodded along with opinions that made me uncomfortable, storing my real reactions in some internal vault that I'd gradually forgotten how to access. I had become an expert at reading rooms and adjusting my personality accordingly. I could sense Patricia's mood from the moment I walked into her house and modify my behavior to complement it. I knew exactly how much enthusiasm to show for Robert's stories without upstaging his punchlines. I had learned to laugh at Lisa's humor even when it came at someone else's expense, because being part of the group felt more important than standing up for my principles. The woman lying in this bed bore so little resemblance to the woman I'd been at 25 that she felt like a stranger. I couldn't remember the last time I'd had a passionate opinion about anything, the last time I'd stayed up late reading something that moved me, the last time I'd felt excited about an idea or a dream that was entirely my own. I thought about Lisa's comment again, hearing it with fresh ears. If Sarah died tomorrow, honestly, no one would even notice. The cruelest part wasn't that she'd said it was that she'd been right. The version of me that existed in their lives was so careful, so accommodating, so self-effacing that my absence would create barely a ripple. I had made myself so easy to overlook that being overlooked had become inevitable. But here's what Lisa didn't know, what none of them knew. There was another version of me that they'd never met. A woman with strong opinions and deep feelings, and dreams that had nothing to do with potato salad recipes or family gathering logistics. A woman who cried at poetry and stayed up late wondering about the meaning of life and had thoughts worth sharing if anyone had ever bothered to ask. That woman had been buried so deep beneath years of accommodation and people-pleasing that even I had forgotten she existed. But lying there in the dark, feeling the weight of my own invisibility, I could sense her stirring. She was angry about the years we'd wasted being someone else's idea of perfect. She was furious about the dreams we'd abandoned and the voice we'd silenced. She was done being invisible. The question was whether I was brave enough to let her resurface. Becoming visible again would mean risking everything I'd built through careful accommodation. It would mean potentially losing David if he couldn't love the real me. It would mean facing rejection from his family if they couldn't accept an authentic version of who I was. It would mean rebuilding relationships, rediscovering interests, and learning to trust my own voice again after years of silencing it. But the alternative, continuing to live as a ghost in my own life, felt worse than any of those risks. I was 32 years old, which meant I potentially had 50 more years ahead of me. Did I want to spend them being pleasant and forgettable? Or did I want to spend them being real? As dawn started to creep through the bedroom curtains, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to stop being invisible. I was going to resurrect the woman I used to be and introduce her to the world, starting with my own husband. Whether anyone liked what they found remained to be seen, but at least they would finally see me. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it began the morning after that sleepless night with a single, simple act of rebellion. I made coffee the way I actually liked it, strong and black, instead of the milky sweet version I'd been drinking for years because David preferred it that way. It was such a small thing, but as I took that first bitter sip, I felt like I was tasting myself for the first time in years. David noticed immediately. "Something wrong with the coffee?" he asked, looking confused as he added his usual cream and sugar. "Nothing's wrong," I said, meeting his eyes across the kitchen table. "I just decided I wanted to try something different." He gave me an odd look, but didn't pursue it, and I realized that this was how it would go. One small reclamation at a time, each authentic choice feeling like a radical act after years of self-erasure. I was going to have to relearn who I was while simultaneously teaching everyone around me that I was someone worth knowing. That weekend, instead of spending Saturday helping Patricia organize her closets as I'd done countless times before, I drove to the art supply store and bought a sketch pad and charcoal pencils. I hadn't drawn in over 6 years, but my hands remembered the weight of the tools, the way the charcoal felt against paper. I spent the afternoon in our backyard, sketching the old oak tree whose branches I'd admired but never really studied before. David found me there when he came home from his golf game, and the expression on his face was one I couldn't immediately interpret. Surprise, certainly, but also something that might have been recognition, as if he was seeing traces of the woman he'd originally fallen in love with. "I didn't know you still drew," he said, looking over my shoulder at the rough sketch I'd been working on. "I never stopped wanting to," I replied, not looking up from my work. "I just stopped making time for it." "Why now?" he asked, and I heard genuine curiosity in his voice rather than the annoyance I'd expected. I set down the charcoal and looked at him directly. "Because I realized I've been disappearing, piece by piece, and I don't want to disappear completely." He sat down on the grass beside me, something he hadn't done in years. "What do you mean disappearing?" This was the conversation I'd been both dreading and hoping for, the chance to explain what I was beginning to understand about myself and our relationship. "When was the last time you asked me what I was thinking about something that mattered? When was the last time we talked about anything deeper than schedules and household logistics?" David was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him mentally reviewing our recent interactions. "I guess I thought you were happy," he said eventually. "You never complained. You seemed content with our life." "I was content," I admitted. "But content isn't the same as fulfilled. I've been so focused on being the wife you needed that I forgot to be the person I wanted to be." Over the following weeks, I began the slow process of reintroducing myself to my own life. I rejoined the library and checked out 3 poetry collections, staying up late to read them by lamplight while David watched television in the other room. I called Emma, my old college roommate, and we talked for 2 hours about everything we'd missed in each other's lives. I signed up for a Saturday morning art class, even though it meant missing Patricia's weekly coffee gatherings. Each choice felt simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. I was breaking patterns I'd maintained for years, challenging expectations that had been built around my careful accommodation of everyone else's needs. Some changes were met with confusion, others with resistance, but all of them felt necessary. The Phi art class was particularly revelatory. Surrounded by other adults who were there purely for the joy of creating something, I remembered what it felt like to be passionate about something that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. My instructor, a woman in her 60s named Margaret, treated my opinions about composition and color with the same respect she gave to students who'd been painting for decades. "You have a strong intuitive sense," she told me after my 3rd class, studying a watercolor I'd attempted of the view from our kitchen window. "Have you considered taking some advanced workshops?" The compliment hit me like warm sunshine. When was the last time someone had recognized a talent in me, encouraged me to develop it further? When was the last time I'd been seen as someone with potential rather than just someone who was helpful? I started keeping a journal again, something I'd abandoned years earlier because it felt self-indulgent to spend time writing about my own thoughts and experiences. But now those thoughts and experiences felt worth documenting, worth examining, worth treating as valuable pieces of a life that mattered. The hardest part was navigating David's reactions to these changes. Some days he seemed intrigued by this version of me, asking about my art class or listening when I shared something I'd read that excited me. Other days he seemed frustrated by my new unavailability, annoyed that I was less focused on his needs and more focused on my own development. "You're different," he said one evening after I'd declined to watch his preferred television show in favor of reading a novel I'd been engrossed in. "Is that bad?" I asked, looking up from my book. He considered the question seriously, which I appreciated. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "I'm still figuring out how I feel about it." His honesty was both painful and hopeful. At least he was engaging with the reality of who I was becoming instead of dismissing it or trying to minimize it. At least he was recognizing that something significant was happening, even if he wasn't sure how he felt about it. I also began the delicate work of establishing boundaries with his family. When Patricia called to ask if I could help her prepare for another gathering, I politely explained that I had other commitments that weekend. When Lisa made another casual comment at my expense, I looked her directly in the eye and said, "I'd prefer if you didn't make jokes about me like that." The silence that followed was uncomfortable, but it was a different kind of discomfort than I'd experienced after swallowing her previous cruel comments. This was the discomfort of being seen, of taking up space, of refusing to participate in my own diminishment. It was scary, but it was also liberating. "I was just kidding," Lisa said, but there was less confidence in her voice than usual. "I know," I replied calmly, "but I don't find those kinds of jokes funny, so I'd appreciate it if you kept them to yourself." David looked surprised by my directness, but he didn't contradict me or apologize for my behavior as he might have in the past. Progress, I thought, came in small increments. The most profound change was internal. For the first time in years, I began to feel like I was living my life, rather than performing it. I had opinions again, preferences that weren't filtered through what other people wanted from me. I stayed up late when I felt like it, ate foods I enjoyed, wore clothes that reflected my actual taste rather than what seemed appropriate for my role as David's wife. I wasn't becoming someone new. I was becoming someone I'd always been but had buried under years of accommodation and people-pleasing. The woman who was emerging felt both familiar and foreign, like reconnecting with a childhood friend after decades apart. Whether my marriage could survive this transformation remained an open question. Whether David could love the real me as much as he'd appreciated the convenient version remained to be seen. But for the first time in years, I was more interested in being myself than in being loved for being someone else. As I continued the process of reclaiming myself, I discovered something wonderful and unexpected. There were people in the world who actually wanted to know the real me. They had been there all along, waiting for me to show up authentically, but I'd been too busy performing my role as the perfect wife to notice them or give them access to who I really was. It started with Margaret, my art instructor, who invited me to join a small group of her students who met monthly to visit galleries and discuss what they'd seen. I almost declined automatically, my brain immediately calculating how the timing might conflict with David's family obligations. But then, I caught myself in that old pattern and decided to say yes instead. The first gallery visit was a revelation. Standing in front of a series of abstract paintings, listening to these women discuss color and composition and emotional impact, I felt parts of my brain lighting up that had been dormant for years. When Margaret asked what I thought about a particular piece, I found myself sharing an interpretation that surprised even me with its depth and insight. "That's a fascinating way to see it," said Clara, a retired teacher who'd been painting for 15 years. "I hadn't considered the relationship between the vertical lines and the sense of containment you're describing. I had forgotten what it felt like to have someone build on my ideas rather than dismiss them, to be treated as someone whose perspective added value to a conversation. These women asked follow-up questions, challenged my observations thoughtfully, and shared their own insights in return. For the first time in years, I felt intellectually engaged and valued for my mind, rather than my ability to anticipate and meet others' needs. I also reconnected with Emma, my college roommate, who lived about an hour away, and whom I'd been neglecting for years. When I called her and explained that I was in the process of rediscovering myself after years of losing myself in my marriage, she didn't seem surprised. "I've been wondering when you'd figure that out," she said with characteristic directness. I tried to stay connected, but it felt like I was talking to a polite stranger instead of my friend Sarah. "I've missed the real you." We started meeting for coffee once a month, and those conversations became a lifeline. Emma remembered the woman I used to be and wasn't afraid to call me out when I slipped into old patterns of self-diminishment. She also celebrated every small step I took toward authenticity, treating my journey back to myself as the significant undertaking it was. "Remember how you used to have such strong opinions about everything?" she said during one of our coffee dates. "You could argue about literature for hours. You had this passion for ideas that was infectious." "I remember," I said, feeling a familiar pang of grief for that lost version of myself. "I just started thinking that kind of intensity wasn't attractive in a wife." "Attractive to whom?" Emma asked pointedly. "To David? Because if he can't handle you being passionate and intelligent, maybe that says more about him than it does about you." Through Emma, I met other women who were navigating similar journeys of self-discovery. There was Rachel, who was rediscovering her love of hiking after years of being told it was too dangerous by an overprotective husband. There was Nina, who had returned to school at 40 to finish the degree she'd abandoned when she got married. There was Susan, who had started writing poetry again after decades of being told it was an impractical waste of time. These women became my chosen family, the people who saw and valued my authentic self without requiring me to perform any particular role to earn their affection. With them, I could express opinions, share dreams, voice fears, and explore ideas without worrying about whether I was being too much or not enough. They didn't need me to be convenient or accommodating. They needed me to be real. The contrast with David's family became more stark as I developed these genuine connections. At my art group's monthly meetings, my thoughts and feelings were treated as interesting and important. At David's family gatherings, I was still primarily valued for my potato salad and my willingness to clear dishes. With Emma and my new friends, I could spend hours discussing books, art, politics, and philosophy. With David's family, conversations remained surface level and functional. I began to understand that the problem wasn't just that I had made myself invisible. It was that I had surrounded myself with people who were comfortable with my invisibility, who didn't challenge me to be more than helpful and pleasant. My new friendships showed me what it felt like to be in relationships where my full humanity was not just tolerated, but celebrated. David noticed the change in my energy when I came home from these gatherings. "You seem different after your art meetings," he observed one evening. "Happier, more animated." "I feel more like myself," I explained. "These women see me as someone worth listening to. They're interested in my thoughts and ideas, not just my ability to remember their preferences and make their lives easier." I could see him processing this, trying to understand what I was telling him about our relationship without saying it directly. The implication was clear. I wasn't getting from him and his family what I was finding with these new friends. The most profound shift came when I realized I had stopped looking to David and his family for validation. I no longer needed Patricia to compliment my cooking, or Lisa to include me in her jokes, or David to appreciate my efforts at family gatherings. I was getting my emotional needs met through relationships where I was valued for who I was rather than what I did. This wasn't about replacing David or abandoning his family. It was about building a support system that saw and celebrated my authentic self. For the first time in years, I had people in my life who would notice if I disappeared, not because I made their lives more convenient, but because they genuinely valued my presence, my perspective, and my friendship. Having these connections gave me the strength to continue making changes in other areas of my life. When you know that there are people who see your worth, it becomes easier to stop accepting relationships where your worth is invisible. When you experience what it feels like to be truly known and appreciated, you become less willing to settle for being tolerated or taken for granted. I was building a life that felt sustainable and authentic, surrounded by people who encouraged my growth rather than depending on my diminishment. Whether David and his family could adapt to this new version of me remained to be seen, but I was no longer willing to sacrifice my authentic self to find out. I had found my people, and more importantly, I had found myself. The moment of truth came at Robert's birthday celebration 6 months after my transformation began. I almost didn't attend, tempted to use my art class as an excuse to skip what I knew would be another test of my new boundaries. But I realized that avoiding the gathering would be another form of hiding, and I was done hiding. I arrived at the party as myself, not the accommodating version I'd performed for years, but the woman I was becoming. I wore a dress I actually liked instead of something I thought Patricia would approve of. I brought a bottle of wine I'd chosen because I enjoyed it, not because I was trying to anticipate everyone else's preferences. Most significantly, I arrived without the usual arsenal of homemade contributions that had been my ticket to acceptance for so many years. The absence of my elaborate offerings was noticed immediately. "No potato salad today?" Patricia asked, and I could hear the slight disapproval in her voice. "Not today," I said simply, without the apologetic explanation I would have provided in the past. "I thought I'd just enjoy being here instead of spending all morning cooking." Patricia looked momentarily confused, as if she couldn't quite process the idea of me showing up just to socialize rather than to serve. This was new territory for all of us. I moved through the gathering differently than I had before. Instead of immediately busying myself with helpful tasks, I sat down and joined conversations. When Robert started telling one of his familiar stories, I listened but didn't perform the exaggerated interest I used to fake. When David's cousin asked about my art classes, I answered enthusiastically instead of downplaying my new passion as a silly hobby. The change in dynamics was immediately apparent. Without my usual role as the helpful background presence, I became visible in ways that seemed to make everyone slightly uncomfortable. They were used to me as a supporting character, not as someone who might have her own interesting experiences to share. The confrontation I'd been unconsciously preparing for came when Lisa arrived with her boyfriend Mark. She was in one of her performative moods, holding court with stories about her nursing program and making her usual array of cutting observations about people who weren't present to defend themselves. When the conversation turned to a mutual acquaintance who'd recently gotten divorced, Lisa launched into her typical commentary. "I always thought she was too needy," she said with characteristic smugness. "Some women just don't know how to exist without constant attention and validation. It's exhausting for everyone around them." In the past, I would have nodded along or stayed silent, unwilling to risk Lisa's disapproval by challenging her casual cruelty. But something had shifted in me over the past months. I had learned what it felt like to be seen and valued, and I was no longer willing to participate in the diminishment of myself or anyone else. "That's an interesting perspective," I said calmly, looking directly at Lisa. "I've always thought it takes courage to ask for what you need instead of pretending you don't need anything at all." The group went quiet. Lisa looked genuinely startled, as if she couldn't quite believe I had contradicted her. This wasn't how I was supposed to behave. I was supposed to be agreeable, supportive of whatever she said, careful not to create any friction. "Well," Lisa said, recovering quickly, "I suppose some people are just more independent than others." "Independence is important," I agreed, "but so is being honest about your emotional needs. Pretending you don't have any doesn't make you strong. It just makes you invisible." I could feel David watching me with an expression I couldn't read. Patricia was looking between Lisa and me as if she wasn't sure how to navigate this new dynamic. Robert seemed oblivious to the undercurrent of tension, but Mark looked intrigued by this version of me he'd never encountered before. Lisa wasn't done. "Some people just handle things better than others," she said, and I could hear the edge in her voice. "They don't need to make everything about themselves." This was the moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for since that day at the barbecue, when she joked about my death going unnoticed. This was my chance to stand up for myself, to refuse to participate in my own diminishment. "You're absolutely right," I said, my voice steady and clear. "Some people are better at handling things quietly. But there's a difference between handling things well and disappearing completely. I spent years trying to be so easy to deal with that I almost stopped existing. I'm not interested in being that invisible anymore." The silence that followed was thick with years of unspoken dynamics suddenly dragged into the light. Lisa opened her mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of it. For once in our 7-year relationship, she appeared to be at a loss for words. David broke the tension by changing the subject to Robert's birthday plans, but I could feel the shift in the room's energy. I had drawn a line, claimed space, refused to shrink back into the comfortable invisibility that had defined my role in this family for so long. Later, as we were preparing to leave, Patricia approached me with an expression I'd never seen before, something that might have been respect, or at least recognition that something significant had changed. "You seemed different today," she said, not unkindly. "More present." "I feel more present," I replied honestly. "I'm learning how to show up as myself instead of just showing up to be helpful." She nodded thoughtfully, and I realized that my transformation was forcing everyone in David's family to reconsider who they thought I was and what they expected from me. Some of them might not like the changes, but they could no longer pretend I was invisible. As we drove home, David was unusually quiet. Finally, he said, "That was brave, what you did with Lisa." "It didn't feel brave," I said. "It felt necessary." "I'm still getting used to this version of you," he admitted. "But I think I like her better than the one who was always trying to disappear." It was the first time he'd explicitly acknowledged that I had been disappearing, and the first time he'd suggested that my visibility might be something he could learn to appreciate. It wasn't a complete transformation of our relationship, but it was a beginning. A year later, I can see how profoundly everything changed after I decided to stop being invisible. It wasn't a dramatic revolution with explosive confrontations and broken relationships. Instead, it was a quiet transformation that rippled through every aspect of my life, gradually reshaping my world into something I actually wanted to live in. My marriage with David evolved in ways I hadn't expected. Once I stopped performing the role of the perfect wife and started showing up as a complete person, our relationship became more honest, more complex, and ultimately more satisfying. We had real conversations again, not just logistics about schedules and household management, but discussions about ideas, dreams, and the things that mattered to us individually. David had to adjust to being married to someone who had opinions, preferences, and needs that didn't always align with his own. There were moments of friction, times when he seemed frustrated by my newfound unavailability for his every convenience. But there were also moments of genuine connection that we hadn't experienced in years, conversations that reminded us both why we'd fallen in love in the first place. "I forgot how interesting you are," he told me one evening after I'd shared my thoughts about a documentary we'd watched together. "I missed having a wife I could actually talk to about things that matter." His admission was both healing and heartbreaking. Healing because it acknowledged that I was worth knowing. Heartbreaking because it revealed how long I'd been unknown in my own marriage. My relationship with David's family also evolved, though not always in comfortable ways. Some members, like Patricia, seemed to gradually accept and even appreciate this more authentic version of me. She began asking about my art classes with genuine interest, and our conversations deepened beyond surface-level pleasantries. Lisa struggled more with the changes. She seemed uncomfortable with my refusal to laugh at her cutting humor, frustrated by my willingness to express different opinions, and confused by my transformation from agreeable background presence to active participant in family dynamics. But even she eventually adapted, our interactions becoming more respectful, if less comfortable. Robert, perhaps surprisingly, embraced the changes most readily. "I like this version of you better," he told me at a subsequent gathering. "You're more interesting to talk to when you actually say what you think." Some relationships didn't survive my transformation, and I've made peace with that. A few of David's cousins seemed to prefer the helpful, invisible version of me, and gradually stopped including me in their conversations. Some family friends found my newfound authenticity threatening or uncomfortable, and began keeping their distance. These losses stung, but they also clarified something important. Relationships that required my diminishment weren't worth preserving. I'd rather have fewer connections that honored my full humanity than many connections that only valued my utility. The most profound changes were in the new relationships I built and the old ones I reclaimed. My friendship with Emma deepened into something richer and more meaningful than it had been even in college. My art group became a source of ongoing inspiration and support. I developed a small but significant circle of people who knew and appreciated the real me. I also discovered interests and passions I'd forgotten I had. I returned to reading poetry, stayed up late exploring ideas that excited me, and began writing again, not just journaling, but attempting to craft pieces that might be worth sharing with others. I signed up for weekend workshops, joined a book club, and allowed myself to be curious about the world in ways I'd suppressed for years. Professionally, I found the courage to pursue opportunities I'd been avoiding out of fear they might inconvenience David's schedule. I applied for a position that excited me, one that came with more responsibility and occasional evening commitments. When I got the job, David's initial frustration gave way to pride in my accomplishments. "I forgot how ambitious you used to be," he said after I'd successfully completed my first major project in the new role. "It's inspiring to watch you pursue something you care about." The woman I became wasn't entirely different from the woman I'd been at 25, but she was wiser, more intentional, and less afraid of taking up space. I learned to distinguish between healthy compromise and self-erasure, between being supportive and being invisible. Most importantly, I learned that being loved for who you really are is worth the risk of being rejected for who you really are. The relationships that survived my transformation became deeper and more meaningful. The relationships that didn't survive weren't worth maintaining at the cost of my authentic self. If I died tomorrow now, people would notice. Not because I'd made their lives easier, but because I'd made their lives richer. Emma would miss our passionate conversations about books and ideas. Margaret would miss my perspective in our art discussions. David would miss the woman who challenged him to think differently, not just the one who remembered to buy his favorite coffee. Lisa's cruel joke had been intended to diminish me, but it ended up liberating me. In trying to make me feel invisible, she helped me realize that I'd already made myself disappear. Her words were the wake-up call I needed to start the long journey back to myself. Has life ever led you to create a family outside of blood ties? I'd really appreciate hearing your thoughts in the comments. Your stories matter. And if this journey touched something inside you, feel free to support the channel or pass this video along to someone who needs it.